Bring in show music, please.
Hi, I'm CNBC producer Katie Kramer. Today on Squawk Pod. AI is changing the world, and fast. But making it go requires literal infrastructure, data centers. Author and technologist Jared Cohen on the piece of the AI race we don't talk enough about, but is actually the revolution.
These large language models can be transformative in terms of capturing energy efficiency. The problem is in the short term, in order to run these large language models, you need a lot of baseload power.
And the debate over the Federal Reserve's role in a new Trump administration, and even the central bank's independence.
It's almost heretical. It reminded me of religion. It's such a sacred cow.
As Fed Chairman Powell starts a new phase of monetary policy.
This recalibrating policy, recalibration of our policy.
That is supposed to be post-pandemic, post-inflation. President Trump's former Fed pick, Judy Shelton, says it is time to break through the way things have been.
This idea that an authoritarian president is going to try to browbeat the Fed. When the Fed made that decision in September, only one member of the Board of Governors disagreed, and it was the first time in 19 years.
Plus, the market moves this November, Elon Musk's balance sheet, and filling out the staff directory for the Trump transition. Our Eamon Javers is in West Palm Beach.
The fact that they're moving so quickly does give you a sense that a lot of this was pre-baked.
It is Tuesday, November 12th, 2024.
That was only a week ago.
Squawk Pod begins right now.
Stand Becky by in 3, 2, 1. Cue it, please.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Squawk Box right here on CNBC. We are live from the NASDAQ market site in Times Square. I'm Becky Quick along with Joe Kernan and Andrew Ross Sorkin. It's Tuesday. Joe's right. It's only been a week since the election, but boy, have we seen some moves ever since. Both the S&P and the NASDAQ set new records yet again yesterday. It does come after the Dow was up by 304 points as well in yesterday's session. S&P 500 and NASDAQ inched marginally higher, but again, we are talking about some major moves. I think the S&P is up about 4% since the election day. If you're looking at much bigger moves, you might be checking out Bitcoin. It's up about 32% since election day. And then you've got Tesla shares that are up by about 40% since election day. If you're watching the Treasury market this morning, it was closed yesterday for Veterans Day. This morning, you are looking at higher yields. The 10-year at 359 and the 2-year at 431.
President-elect Trump continues to staff key roles in his new administration. Eamon Javers has been selected. Oh, no. I'm sorry. You're not. That wouldn't be. I thought that's what I was leading to, Eamon. I was just reading. Joins us now from West Palm Beach, Florida, with the latest. You're not expecting a call, are you?
No, I would be wildly unqualified for any of these positions, Joe. But look, yesterday on Veterans Day, we saw the Trump administration, the incoming Trump administration, Trump transition, fleshing out the defense side, the national security side, the diplomatic side of their upcoming administration, starting with Marco Rubio, the Florida senator, who is expected now to be named as Secretary of State. Rubio, of course, a one-time Trump opponent who has now sort of worked his way back into Trump's good graces. He is seen as acceptable to the MAGA base, but also simpatico with Donald Trump on the two key foreign policy issues. That is on the issue of China. Rubio very much a China hawk, and also on the issue of Ukraine funding. He's a skeptic on Ukraine funding. Also, Congressman Mike Waltz expected now to be named National Security Advisor. Mike Waltz is a former U.S. Army Green Beret who served overseas. He's also somebody who played a key role for the Trump campaign during the convention back in Milwaukee. And South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem now expected to be named Secretary of Homeland Security. She is somebody who was considered by President-elect Trump as a possible running mate as vice president. Now she's apparently going to be getting Homeland Security. All this is a little bit TBD until the official announcements come, but we do expect that she will get that slot, and that puts her in charge of a key piece of Donald Trump's domestic policy, that is immigration. She'll be running border issues for the administration, and so that will be a key priority for them. We expect now Donald Trump to travel to Washington tomorrow to meet with Joe Biden and also to meet with Speaker of the House Mike Johnson, and Republican leadership, TBD on which Republican leader he'll meet with, because they're in the middle of their Senate Republican election today and tomorrow. So we'll see who exactly Trump sits down with in Washington, but he'll have a chance to reset in the nation's capital, as well as picking all the folks folks that he's picking for his new administration down here in Mar-a-Lago, guys. Back over to you.
Do you have any idea, Eamon, whether Rick Scott has been getting more votes than he did previously? He was sort of a dark horse. Do you hear any scuttlebutt, or does Thune have the inside track?
I don't. You know, what's funny is down here, everybody's focused on the new administration and much less chatter about what's going on among Senate Republicans. Obviously, in Washington, that's a crucial area. And it was so fascinating to see over the weekend Donald Trump tweeting out, or posting out, I should say, anybody who wants to run for leader in the Republican Senate needs to support recess appointments. Which is an idea that might give Donald Trump a lot more latitude in getting his nominees through up on Capitol Hill. If they do enter a recess very early on in the new term, Trump could nominate a lot of people to his cabinet without necessarily getting that Senate confirmation. And so if he has people he wants to pick on his mind down here in Mar-a-Lago, and he doesn't think they can get a Senate confirmation vote, if he can get Republican leadership to go along with that, and they all seem to be very willing to fall in line, then he might be able to get people
That's
into the
when we
cabinet
could get you in,
that he otherwise
Eamon.
would not be able to be.
That's when we could get you in. If you're
on a recess appointment?
When all the totally unqualified people get in, it's during a recess appointment, I think, right?
I would qualify as totally unqualified, Joe. Look, all I'm trying to do down here is, all I want is an invite to Mar-a-Lago for lunch. I hear it's fantastic. Let me know if you know anybody.
All right. I will let you know that you were ready to talk. I saw it. I know you.
No, I was going to ask him if there was any news. I wanted to know about scuttlebutt around some of the financial figures in terms
Treasury,
of down
Commerce.
there. Treasury, Commerce, NEC, like if there was anything new to the names that we've already heard bandied about, Eamon.
Yeah, nothing yet, but they did sort of national security and defense all at once, so you wonder if they're going to do the economy team all at once too coming up.
But do you
and
think
a lot
it's
of those
already
names floating around are the same
pre-baked?
names that we've been hearing for a week.
Do you think
I think
it's
a lot of this
pre-baked?
has been the fact that they're moving so quickly does give you a sense that a lot of this was pre-baked. A lot of this had been thought through already.
And that's probably Susie Wiles at work. I mean, she said, I think she told donors yesterday that they're looking at this as if they have 2 years to get things done, not 4, which is smart. You've got midterm elections that can change agendas, and presidents also often have to deal with that 2 years in. So it sounds like they want to hit the ground running and get as much accomplished as quickly as possible.
Yeah. They are moving very fast, and what a change from what we saw last time around after the 2016 election, where it was real chaos on the Trump side. This is much more efficient, much more smooth in terms of the rollout, and you do get the sense that they are prepared and they know what they're doing.
Right.
Okay.
Shares of Tesla have jumped nearly 40% since President Trump's electoral victory last week. As of yesterday's close, those gains have lifted Elon Musk's net worth by about $70 billion to close to $320 billion. That's according to Forbes. That puts him ahead of Larry Ellison, who is now the world's second richest person, by nearly $90. That's $90 billion. Elon Musk is ahead of him by about $90 billion. There was a Bloomberg report talking about how hedge funds betting against Elon Musk had lost about $5.2 billion in paper losses since the election last week. Anybody who was shorting the stock obviously has gotten hurt pretty badly. Right now, shares of Tesla at $340.28.
Ron Barron's chortling somewhere. But we're back to Brewster's Millions.
How do you spend it quick enough?
You just can never. $320 billion.
It's hard to even imagine how
That's
much money
why, you know what you do? You build a really nice house on Mars, I think. I mean, with a lot of land. I mean, you probably got...
I don't even think he has a house here.
You don't even need fences, I don't think. But he could do that. That's that much money. He could build a house on Mars. What else would you do with it? How
build
could you
rockets
possibly,
to get you to Mars, I think.
But it's not even his money. So I'm just trying to figure out what that would feel like to... I don't know what that would... It would not... Your life would not be about money. That's all that there is to it. It'd be about politics,
All sorts of other things.
Yeah.
Cheese will be next.
Coming up next on Squawk Pod, what's powering the artificial intelligence revolution? Author, former Googler, and now Goldman Sachs exec Jared Cohen says solar and wind energy won't cut it.
You need baseload power. So think nuclear, coal, natural gas. We have plenty of that in the US. The problem is we can't transport it from where it is through multiple jurisdictions because of not in my backyard.
where that leaves America's AI innovation and how we stack up against the competition right after this. This is Squawk Pod.
Up and Andrew, Q.
You're watching Squawk Box on CNBC. I'm Andrew Ross Sorkin along with Joe Kernan and Becky Quick. Artificial intelligence requires an abundant amount of energy, and the AI boom means that companies are pouring huge sums of money into building data centers. For more on this and a whole bunch of other topics, I want to bring in Jared Cohen. He's the president of global affairs at Goldman Sachs. He's the co-head of Goldman Sachs' Global Institute. He's also former CEO of Google's Jigsaw. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
You talk about AI, but really you're talking these days about sort of the diplomacy that may be required around the idea of these data centers and how much energy is being consumed and how much energy is being used. But when you talk about diplomacy as it relates to AI, what are you talking about? Well,
first of all, let's start with what the problem is. So there's a lot of known unknowns around generative AI. Large language models versus small models. Will the use cases ever justify the spend? But to me, the more urgent.
But by the way, what do you think to that big question?
I think it's too early to know.
Okay.
I think there's a much more urgent question, which is, can we actually build enough capacity to meet all this demand? And the short answer is we can, but not exclusively in the U.S. The U.S. doesn't have enough powered land. It doesn't have enough differentiated data centers. It doesn't have enough baseload power that it can transport to those data centers.
What does a differentiated data center mean?
So if you look at data centers for cloud workloads versus data centers for AI workloads. Data centers for AI workloads they're ultra high density. They require a concentrated power source. And so intermittent power like wind and solar, they don't fit the bill. So you need baseload power. So think nuclear, coal, natural gas. And we have plenty of that in the US. The problem is we can't transport it from where it is through multiple jurisdictions because of not in my backyard.
Right.
And so the U.S. is going to need some kind of an overflow option if it wants to continue leading in this space. And there's not a single geography that I would say represents a panacea to this problem.
So when you talk about sort of diplomacy around this, is the idea that you would put these data centers in Mexico and in Canada and hope that you could somehow benefit from them that way? Or where would you be placing these things?
So the U.S. has three options for where this overflow could happen, and none of them are ideal. One option is you keep it in the democratic world, which would obviously be the sort of preferable option. So think Canada, Australia, the Nordic countries, which is good for liquid cooling, France.
You could do it in Australia and still get the benefit here, given the how much you need to communicate back and forth?
Well, so one of the things that's happened with technological innovation is we have a separation now between training and inference. So that's unlocked a lot of new geographies.
Okay.
The problem with keeping it in the democratic world is all these countries that I just mentioned, they have the same issue that we have in the U.S., right? ESG concerns, not in my backyard concerns. And so what are the other two options? One option is you kind of go with the default choice, which is, persist where it already exists in the global south. So think Malaysia, Indonesia, where you have cheap energy. The problem is a lot of that capacity goes to China. So you have a national security concern. And then the third option, probably has the best conditions, which is the Middle East, right? Cheap energy. They know how to build massive amounts of infrastructure at scale. They can build it. They have plenty of land. They can do it near the sea for liquid cooling. They have the sovereign ambition to do it. The challenge is once they have all that capacity, these are geopolitical swing states. So how do you keep them on sides?
How do you keep them on sides? So what would you do? What are you telling clients to do?
Well, I mean, first and foremost, this is really a U.S. government. It's the U.S. government's choice first and foremost because of export controls, right? So the U.S. gets to decide who can get the chips and who can't get the chips, right? And so this is an interesting policy question that's going to play out in the new administration. So when you think about these three different options, you have to view it through the lens of the new administration that was just elected.
But it's export controls that matter in this regard?
So it turns out that there's a limit. So if you think about the geopolitical swing states, right? These are countries that have these are countries that benefit from sustained tensions between the U.S. and China because they have a differentiated amount of the supply chain. They're attractive for nearshoring, offshoring, and friendshoring. They have an abundant amount of capital, and they're led by individuals.
I like that you call them swing states.
Well, they swing on an issue-by-issue basis, right? So you think about India. India stayed neutral on Ukraine, is aligned with the U.S. on China. If you look at the countries in the Middle East, these countries pick and choose what issues they want to align with the U.S. on, right? And so it turns out that there's a limit, though, to how hard they can swing. These countries can't just do whatever they want when it comes to AI, because at the end of the day, they need the U.S. government to allow them to actually have access to the technology.
Hey, Jared, the question about why we have so much control over the chips when a lot of these aren't even U.S. companies, we were talking about this yesterday, and I'm not sure I even understand. Is it because we are the biggest purchaser, and you have to make sure that you listen to us if you want to do business with us?
So it comes down to, we have a huge amount of dominance in the U.S. because of the hyperscalers. The hyperscalers are the biggest purchasers, of the chips. Obviously, NVIDIA has, a massive amount of influence in terms of allocation. They're not, the only player, but they have a massive amount of influence in terms of the allocation. And so, the U.S. has kind of an incumbent advantage in this. And what's interesting is, if you asked me before generative AI what the technology story was between the U.S. and China, I would have said the U.S. had a 3-decade first mover advantage over China, and it kind of looked like it was ending in a tie. And then when we all found out about generative AI at the same time on November 30th, 2022, it gave the U.S. a technology lifeline because China didn't have the compute power that was required to run these large language models. Interestingly, it was because export controls had been put in place on graphic processing units, which are the chips that are required to run these large language models, just a month before we all found out about ChatGPT.
So, do you see any company that's outside of the U.S. excelling in this space?
Look, there's certainly plenty of incentive for that to happen.
But it hasn't happened yet, because you were talking about China, and sort of where is China on a relative basis, do you think?
So right now, China has an uphill battle when it comes to generative AI and large language models. I mentioned the lack of compute already. They also don't want to train their existing models at internet scale, and the way they govern their models is restrictive. That being said, one of the things that we're starting to see in China is a sort of efficiency innovation renaissance, where they're using the compute constraints to capture efficiency within the models itself. Now, this is largely an R&D story right now, but what I would say is this is where the whole question of open models versus closed models comes into play. Every time there's an open-weighted model that gets released, that model kind of puts code out into the public domain, and then China has access to that as well.
Jared, we have, once again, the luxury of taking ESG concerns seriously here, because we can pay more if we need to, if we want the inflation. But if capital flows downhill, it's going to places that aren't quite as concerned with that crap. They're going to get the least expensive energy sources. If it goes there, is it a problem that security-wise that it's not here again, and we're going to be back to saying, oh my God, we're vulnerable because we need to onshore all this stuff? And will we be able to use the cheapest energy, hydrocarbons? Will we be able to do the hydrocarbons here? Where, that's what they're going to do if it's India, if it's something like that. They may do coal for a lot of this. Right?
Well, so there's two separate questions here. One is there a risk in having too much of this capacity inside of countries who may decide to share that capacity with an adversary,
or not let us have it at all,
or not let us have it? Right. This is another concern, and this is one of the challenges with having it in a country that is not aligned with the U.S. A geopolitical swing state is never going to fully pivot away from the U.S. So I would argue that that's not a bad choice. But there's a contradiction with some of this technology and some of the ESG goals. And this is true both for AI workloads and also, by the way, for electric vehicles. So if you think about electric vehicles, they require critical minerals and rare earths to be processed and refined. 90+% of that happens in China to go into the batteries, right? And so we outsource, the dirtier part of it gets outsourced to China so that we can have cleaner cars. It's the same thing. With AI, these large language models can be transformative in terms of capturing energy efficiency. The problem is, in the short term, in order to run these large language models, you need a lot of baseload power. And so there's a sort of short-term contradiction that we have to grapple with. And there's not a good answer to this, right? Because you can't use intermittent power because these AI workloads are ultra high density.
I would say in a Trump world, there could be a lot more hydrocarbons doing this domestically, and it sort of obviates the problem that you just talked about. They could be domestic, and we'd still have it cheap.
But you're saying there's still not enough.
There's still not.
Right, still not enough.
So my feeling is the U.S. has plenty of potential to do this, but the need to meet this capacity is so urgent, right? We're going to have to probably bring another 35+ gigawatts of power online relative to the 17 gigawatts of power that are already online feeding these data centers in just the next couple of years. That's not enough. That's not enough time, right? And so the U.S. is going to continue to lead in this space, but it's not going to be able to lead on its own.
Are you sure in Australia, if it's going this way instead of that way, it's not going to be? I mean, it's not going to work. You know what I mean? You sure? Does it work down there the same? You sure?
It does.
You sure?
Before we let you go,
is that true?
We got to mention. We got to mention Jared. Jared's also an author.
I see.
And
that.
now moonlighting as a children's book author of a very cool book that's a bestseller now called Speaking of America. Tell everybody what it's about real quick.
So the book takes one line spoken by every single president. It talks about what was happening in the country when they said it, what they meant by the words, and how the words had an impact. I wrote Speaking of America because I think we have no choice but to talk to our kids about politics at a younger age, because they hear it on TV, they see it on social media, they hear us parents yapping about it, and I wanted to have a resource for parents to be able to talk to their kids about politics and get a little refresher on American history at the same time.
Jared Cohen, thank you for coming in this morning.
19th century presidents, which one of them has a name very similar to a dance?
To a dance?
A dance.
It was on Jeopardy last night. I got it. Nobody got it.
Wait a second.
I don't think there's a Rutherford Hayes dance.
Yeah.
One of them guessed Rutherford Hayes. I'm like, what the hell is that?
I just like saying Rutherford Hayes.
James
so
Polk.
Is there a
The
polk
polka?
dance?
Polka.
That's the polka. Yeah. That's not what
That was the answer on Jeopardy. This is your boomer report. I give a boomer report every day. Yeah,
Okay.
that was one of the.
Thanks for being here for the Boomer Report.
What is James Polk? Who is James Polk? That's the answer. You got to put it in the form of a question, as you know.
Uh-huh.
Right? Maybe you don't.
Thanks for coming in.
All right, thank you.
Next on Squawk Pod, aside from the staffing shuffles happening at Mar-a-Lago, the battle brewing in a new Trump administration is the president-elect versus the Federal Reserve Chair, Jay Powell, who has said he won't be fired.
Not permitted under the law.
Not what?
Not permitted under the law.
While loyalists to the new regime, including in the Senate, question the Fed's independence, established more than 110 years ago, as our Steve Liesman reminds us, by the legislative branch.
The Federal Reserve is a creation of Congress. If you have a problem with the Federal Reserve and the Federal Reserve Act, it's a problem of Congress.
We'll hear from one skeptic of the central bank's internal agreement on rate policy. Judy Shelton says it amounts to groupthink.
Nobody got fired after we had the worst inflation in 40 years. I think it's healthy to challenge some of the powers that have been accumulated by the Federal Reserve.
It's almost orthodoxy.
You're listening to Squawk Pod from CNBC.
Stand by, Joe. His mic, cue.
The Fed's independence has been called into question. Utah Senator Mike Lee calling for an end to the Fed. In a tweet he wrote, in his words, the executive branch should be under the direction of the president. That's how the Constitution was designed. The Federal Reserve is one of many examples of how we have deviated from the Constitution in that regard. Yet another reason why we should, #end the Fed. Our next guest says the senator is standing up for the Constitution with, in her words, courage and insight. And join us now, Independent Institute Senior Fellow Judy Shelton. She was one of President-elect Trump's original Federal Reserve Board nominees. Also with us are Steve Liesman. I was thinking about this yesterday, Judy. It's good to see you. I was thinking about it from the context that it's gotten to the point where if it's a discussion, it's almost heretical. It reminded me of religion to even talk about the idea. It's such a sacred cow. And instead of talking about what might be very good reasons to at least look at the inner workings of the Fed. It's what you always bring to us, the idea that the way the Fed is set up, that it benefited the big money center banks, and it actually caused them to hoard money because they made $1 trillion combined between all of them instead of lending it out. So instead of questioning the way the Fed works, everybody's like, oh my God, this is heresy. It's almost like saying you're going to, get rid of, I don't know, apple pie and hot dogs or something.
Well, I think it has become kind of sacrosanct in a way that prevents us from talking about improvements at the Fed. And if the definition of central bank independence means no legislative oversight, if it means no limits on the financial capabilities of the Federal Reserve, and if it means no real accountability The Fed often claims it has responsibility for stable prices, but nobody got fired after we had the worst inflation in 40 years. So I think it's healthy to challenge some of the powers that have been accumulated by the Federal Reserve.
It's almost orthodoxy, which is another religious term that I think.
Well, should there be limits on how much government debt the Federal Reserve can purchase? Should there be limits on how much base money it can create with a computer keystroke? Should there be limits on the amount of interest it can pay to commercial banks at taxpayer expense to keep reserves sitting at the Fed in depository accounts, doing nothing to provide capital resources to the real economy?
Can I say a question, though? And here's one of the great conundrums of this. If you left the Federal Reserve to effectively be controlled by an executive branch or effectively the American public to effectively vote on what they think the Federal Reserve should or should not be doing, which to some degree is what you're talking about. I think there's degrees here about what we're really talking about. In most cases, I hate to say this, I think the American public would actually make the wrong decision almost every single time. And I think the aftermath of the financial crisis of 2008 is a prime example of that, given the way the public felt at that time.
That was the Fed that when the public had brought us that.
No. But what would have happened is, left to their own devices, we would have shut down the entire system because people would say, we don't want to give any money to banks. Right? That's what would have happened. If you had done a straw vote of the American public of what to do, they would be like, don't give any money to these horrible bankers. They should get nothing.
That's your opinion. I don't know if that would.
But you mean in the aftermath of a global financial meltdown, and I don't know any other institution that would be more responsible for properly calibrating the amount of money and credit in the system than the Federal Reserve.
By the way,
you're talking about resolving it.
This is not to defend the Federal, but I'm saying there will be mistakes made repeatedly, and the question is, if you there will always be mistakes. Let's just accept. You don't believe that mistakes will always get made? Invariably, there's going to be some level of mistake.
Yeah, but I think you're talking about who should have the ability to manipulate interest rates. You're saying I wouldn't want that to be in the executive branch or the legislative.
Correct.
But is the Federal Reserve, should they be doing that?
Although the one point we've made is that we've never seen a president who wanted higher interest rates because it's counter to what they're trying to do, which is stoke the economy and keep things going.
Especially real estate guys.
Can I just make one point of fact, which is that Senator Mike Lee is barking up the wrong tree.
Barking up the wrong neck of the woods.
Whatever. The Federal Reserve is a creation of Congress. The problem is not that the executive branch does not have control over the Fed, because the executive branch did not create the Fed. The Fed is not part of the executive branch. If you have a problem with the Federal Reserve and the Federal Reserve Act, it's a problem of Congress. This flows from the controls of the purse, which is the prerogative of Congress. And that I think the questions that Judy asks are interesting and worth exploring. Should there be limits on how much debt the Fed will? Right. But those are prerogatives of Congress to put on. And there's a reason for that because of some of the things that Andrew said. Whether or not you want to be paying banks to limit the floor on interest rates is an interesting question. Yeah. But you can't say that, like Senator Mike Lee did, which I'm kind of think is a little embarrassing, right? That the problem is the executive branch thing. It's not the executive, it's Congress. If Congress wants to limit these things, it has every ability to get together and do so, but it hasn't done so. It has given the Fed, what Judy points out in an interesting article, is a tripartite mandate, not just two. Correct. There's inflation, unemployment, as well as stable credit. Moderate long-term rates. She wrote an interesting piece on that. But if it's not doing so, and I would just push back a little bit on Judy in the sense that there is oversight of the Fed at Congress. They report twice a year in the Humphrey Hawkins. Anytime the Fed, the Congress wants a Fed official to come, they go and they do provide testimony, and they also respond. If that oversight is not sufficient, it's a problem of Congress, is what I would point out.
Well, Steve is exactly right in the sense that the Fed does answer to Congress because that's in the Constitution.
Right.
That's Article 1, Section 8. And so it's up to Congress to regulate the money. And they have farmed out that responsibility to a government agency.
Right.
And so I think
But
that's
you
what
think-
we're talking about. I just want to say, too, though, you mentioned Trump being a real estate guy. In 2015, when he was first beginning to run for president, he acknowledged that. He said, I'm a real estate guy. Of course I love low rates.
Yeah, he said that frequently.
But he also said, but think of the people who are being responsible, who don't own financial assets, who are putting money in the bank to save for retirement every week. He said they are getting creamed.
Yeah. But that was before he was president, too. I mean, I literally have never heard a president say, we wish
No,
interest
but
rates
think
were
what
higher."
happened to him. He came in, and the very next month, the Fed raised interest rates. This was under Janet Yellen. In 2017, they raised them another 3 times. Then Powell came in. In 2018, they raised them another 4 times. So 8 consecutive increases after being at near zero for all those years post-2008. And Trump made, I think, the logical argument. He said, we haven't hit the target. We're under your 2% target rate. We have record low unemployment that's benefiting minority groups and bringing in more worker participation. We have good economic growth, good productivity. Why would you deliberately, preemptively curtail growth and limit employment when there's no inflation?
Rates came
threat?
down, and everyone said Trump was right.
Rates came down, and
everybody
the
said
Fed should either
that
say,
he was right. Although
did they cave in, or
Can
did
we
they come
pivot
around
to-
to agreeing with him?
Can we pivot to what Judy thinks we ought to do now? I mean, you have this very weird landscape, right? Interest rates are rising. The Fed is cutting. Gold is down. The CRB is down. If you look at inflation expectations in the tips market, they're up a bit. What's the prescription, Judy?
Well, I said, and I've said on this program, I think, of course, zero rates make no sense. When the Fed started raising, by December 2022, they hit a target range of 4.25 to 4.5. That's where I would have said, look, you have a real rate of return on capital. That makes it more productive. You don't get the malinvestment and the distortions. That accepts their 2% inflation rate. And then I would get hands off. It's the constant ratcheting up and ratcheting down. Right now, the Fed has set itself up with 2 frameworks. The original framework for most of this year has been, if we see good growth numbers and high employment, then we're going to keep rates high because that means it'll be inflationary. Then suddenly in September, they flipped to the new recalibration approach. And, you know, this whole thing about that, I think the media sets up this idea that an authoritarian president is going to try to browbeat the Fed. When the Fed made that decision in September, only one member of the Board of Governors disagreed, and it was the first time in 19 years. I mean, if there's any browbeating going on, it's to get consensus at the Fed. And so suddenly now they flip to dropping interest rates. Then they reaffirmed that with another 1/4 point drop. But now this is the first time at a press conference that I heard the chairman start talking about fiscal responsibility and kind of hinting that, well, we might have to increase interest rates. I like the second approach of the Fed, which is to recalibrate, because I think it fits in with a supply side program. Mm-hmm. If you had more growth because of lower taxes, less regulation, if the Fed had a concomitant reduction in interest rate, that dovetails.
The one
now
thing
you
I will
make
say
capital
about
available and affordable, and that expands supply. The Fed's model targets cutting demand.
the one thing I
would
will
like
say
them
about
to go for supply.
Chairman Powell talking now about fiscal responsibility is there's been ramped up pressure on the Fed to do something like that, especially as you've watched the longer end yields rise as they've been cutting rates.
But it's
and that
an
has people
interesting,
focusing on what and why.
change in priority. He would only mention it. I mean, remember how passive he used to be and say, we're staying in our lane, we take fiscal as given.
Yeah, I just say we've had investor after big investor who's come on and said that the Fed should be saying something like this.
And the market is kind of talking
and the market
about
is,
I do think
really
it's worth,
pressure.
by the way, to talk about what Powell said. Because a lot has been made. Is he talking about raising interest rates? He was asked a question, would you raise interest rates? And he said, you know, I don't want to say, but a year from now, we might do it. Who knows? But it's not our plan. So that's not really what he's talking about, essentially.
Fair enough.
I think it's a little bit much to put words in his mouth and say talking about raising interest rates. And I also believe that the idea of the Fed thinking. By the way, Joe has been hot and heavy on this idea. We have a running argument, which is an interesting debate, I think. Should the Fed act in a way to limit the ability of Congress to borrow?
Governor. Judy thinks yes, I think.
I mean, do you Joe thought that
they should at least
higher rates
they should at least
to limit the deficit
they
spending
should
of
at
Congress?
least be like really like look like maybe they don't do anything, but when they see more things getting passed, they're like, Powell should be like this.
And I've called your kids, Joe, and I've said your dad wants you to have the ability to limit his spending.
That's the problem. I am like the Fed with my kids.
Well, I think there's a new emphasis, and that's why I welcome even re-examining our thoughts on the appropriate role of the Fed. A new emphasis on sound finances and sound money.
Right. Instead of a hair on fire moment, I think at least admit that. And we also, we have Warsh on. He's like, why do they keep talking? I don't know if he's going to have anything to do with the Fed in the future, Kevin, at some point. But he's like, stop with the guidance. Stop with the, there's a lot.
Having a press conference at every rate-setting meeting 8 times a year was Chair Powell's idea.
Yeah.
They originally had it on just the meetings where they had the new forecast.
Right.
Look, I'm in favor of a lot more transparency. I'm not sure this is working.
Steve, if we get rid of the Fed, what are you going to do?
Play music.
Your entire beat would be irrelevant.
There's a different question here, which is how do you have this conversation? Like, there may be an important conversation to be had about all of the reforms or things you may want to do to the Fed, and a debate about that. But there's also a danger in the debate itself in a very kind of twisted way, which is if the public and really the investor, the bond market, thinks that this is all going to come undone or is in disarray or just that unto itself can be dangerous. So there's sort of a very interesting question about how do you have that debate? If you believe a debate is needed, how you have it at the same time that you have stability. It's
But
like a very interesting question.
We do have to consider it, but that is a symptom of the problem. The markets are fixated on the Fed. The Fed is too prominent in financial markets.
That may be, but that's like telling the viewers that they're too powerful because they can change the channel. The public has the ability, or the bond market has the ability. You can't change them.
No, but you can have a less activist Fed, and I think that would be very helpful. I think the Fed has self-aggrandized and now sees itself as almost in a duel with a democratically elected president who was elected because of his policies and his promises related to the economic grievances of voters. I mean, we've seen the Fed in the last 4 years. We've had $42 trillion in U.S. household wealth, an increase. 62% of that went to the top 10% wealthiest Americans, the 90th percentile. And I think that creates a sense of monetary favoritism. It's great if you own assets.
That's a different question.
Do you expect to be for Trump to nominate you again? Have you talked to him? I mean, would that?
I don't know. No, I haven't talked with him about that. I was honored. He nominated me twice, both before and after the election, because after January you have to re-enter a nomination, and he did that for me. And I'll always be honored by that.
Joe, could you come back? If you're going to end the Fed, what are you going to replace it with?
I haven't figured that out. It's kind of
you better figure that out.
It's kind of like Obamacare.
Because the dollar is
I've got a
the
plan.
world's reserve currency.
I have a
concept
plan.
of a plan.
I have a plan.
The dollar is still the world's reserve currency.
Well, that's part of the problem.
And that's the pod for today. Thanks for listening. Squawk Box is hosted by Joe Kernan, Becky Quick, and Andrew Ross Sorkin. Tune in weekday mornings on CNBC at 6 Eastern and get the best of our show right in your ears when you follow Squawk Pod wherever you like to listen to podcasts. And tell us what you think. Rate or review Squawk Pod on Apple Podcasts if you'd be so kind. That does help other listeners discover this podcast. That's it. We'll meet you right back here tomorrow.
We are clear. Thanks, guys.